Okay, so picture this for a moment. You're stepping into a world that feels like it's just waking up.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine walking through these vibrant towns and the air is just buzzing with new ideas, Old ways of thinking are being questioned.
Sometimes gently, sometimes not so gently, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this wasn't just some abstract feeling. It was real across Europe, roughly, let's say, 14th to 17th century.
Yeah, that's the time frame, the period we often call the Renaissance.
Right. And for this deep dive, we've gathered a whole stack of sources from that time.
Everything, really. Documents, letters, incredible art, buildings.
A whole lot. And our mission basically is to dig into what these sources tell us about the changing cultural traditions of this era.
Yeah, we want to pull out the key stuff,
Yeah.
the insights that really help us grasp this huge shift.
Okay, so first thing that jumps out from the sources, cities. Towns are growing, sure, but they're becoming these cultural powerhouses.
Absolutely. Like Florence, Venice, Rome, they developed this really distinct urban culture. Centers of art, learning, money.
And the people living there saw themselves as different, right? More civilized, maybe, than folks in the countryside.
That's the sense you get. And a massive engine behind all this, according to the sources, was printing. The invention of printing.
Oh, huge. Suddenly, books aren't these super rare, hand-copied things anymore.
Exactly. Much more accessible. And this didn't just spread ideas far and wide. It changed how people thought about time.
How so?
Well, people could suddenly get their hands on texts from ancient Greece and Rome much more easily, compare them. It created this real sense of history, a contrast between the ancient world and their modern one.
And looking back, that comparison, it started affecting the really big ideas, didn't it?
Yeah, the fundamental stuff. Like religion, for some, it starts feeling more personal, individual, less controlled by the institution.
Right.
And then science starts chipping away at that old earth at the center view.
The one everyone just assumed was true.
Right. And new discoveries, voyages, they're totally flipping the script on the idea that Europe, the Mediterranean, was the center of everything.
It's amazing we can even talk about this with such detail. The amount of stuff that survived.
It's incredible. Documents, books, paintings, buildings, even textiles, loads of it produced, and thankfully, loads of it preserved in archives, museums.
That's our raw material base.
That's the foundation, yeah.
So let's talk about that word, Renaissance. It literally means rebirth.
Right. And it's a label historians started using back in the 19th century to try and capture these huge cultural shifts.
And the key figure here, you have to mention him, is Jacob Burckhardt.
Absolutely. His book from 1860, The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, incredibly influential, still shakes how we think about it.
He was a student of Ranke, right? The big German historian.
Yeah, Leopold von Ranke. And Ranke was all about states, politics, government documents. Very traditional.
But Burckhardt thought that was too narrow.
Exactly. He argued, look, history isn't just politics. You have to look at culture, literature, architecture, painting. It's just as important.
Okay, so what was Burckhardt's big idea about this period, based on the sources he looked at?
His core takeaway was this emerging humanist culture in Italian towns, 14th to 17th centuries. He saw it defined by this brand new belief in the individual.
The individual's capability?
Yeah, the idea that a person could make their own decisions, develop their skills, shape their own life. He basically saw this as the birth of the modern person.
And he contrasted that with the medieval person.
Right, who he argued was sort of controlled by the church, thinking-wise. A stark contrast in his view.
It's a powerful narrative. Very neat.
It is, but the sources also show, well, it's maybe not quite that simple. More recent historians looking at the same stuff, they question if the break was really that sharp.
They see more continuity.
Yeah, they argue that a lot of things Burckhardt called Renaissance actually have roots much further back. It wasn't necessarily this sudden rebirth out of nowhere. You dig deeper, you find connections.
That makes sense. History's rarely neat boxes. Okay, so how did Italy become the crucible for all this? We need to look back a bit, right? After the Roman Empire fell.
Yeah, the sources paint a picture of Italy. Well, kind of fragmented. Ruined towns, no single government. The Pope wasn't a huge political power across the whole peninsula.
Compared to other parts of Europe or the Islamic world.
Exactly. Italy looked relatively weak, disorganized.
But then things started to change. Trade.
That's what the sources point to. Trade expansion. With the Byzantine Empire, Islamic countries, and then later the Mongol Empire opening up the Silk Road, Italian ports were perfectly placed.
Connecting east and west.
Right. And this trade didn't just bring wealth, it fueled the rise of independent city-states.
They stopped seeing themselves as just part of some bigger empire.
Pretty much. Florence and Venice, the sources highlight, were republics. Others were run by princes or powerful families.
And what made cities like Venice and Genoa special, according to the sources?
It was who held the power. Not the clergy, not the old feudal lords like elsewhere in Europe. It was the rich merchants, the bankers. They were actively involved in government.
Fostering that idea of citizenship.
A really strong sense of it, yeah. And the sources say this pride lasted even when, sometimes, military rulers took over these cities.
And we have that amazing inside look from Cardinal Contarini about Venice from 1534.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. He describes how the real power was in this council of gentlemen over 25.
And he's pretty blunt about excluding ordinary people.
Oh, yeah. Explicitly says it's to avoid troubles and popular tumults. Keeps things stable, in his view.
And eligibility.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about money.
He says it was about nobility of lineage or virtue, but he kind of hints that, in reality, being poor, even if you were from a noble family, might get you pushed out. Lineage seems pretty important.
So citizenship maybe wasn't for everyone, even among the elite. Okay, let's shift to ideas. Universities.
Right. Italy had the earliest ones in Europe. Padua, Bologna.
And initially, they were all about law.
Makes sense, doesn't it? All that trade needed lawyers, notaries, people to write contracts, handle disputes.
But then the focus shifted.
Yeah, the sources show people started studying law, but thinking about it in the context of ancient Rome. And that leads us to Petrarch.
Francesco Petrarch, 14th century. What was his big contribution?
His real push was go back to the source, read the original ancient Greek and Roman writers. He saw antiquity as this distinct, brilliant civilization worth studying directly.
And that approach became humanism.
Essentially, yes. By the early 15th century, a humanist was basically a teacher of subjects like grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, moral philosophy subjects derived from Cicero's idea of humanitas, culture.
And the key thing, not primarily religious.
Exactly. The sources emphasize it was about skills developed through discussion, debate, skills for life, for public engagement.
And they really valued debate, didn't they? Pico della Mirandola.
Right. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola.
In his On the Dignity of Man, he compares debate to exercise for the mind. Makes it stronger, sharper.
Amazing. And you see cities like Florence just transformed by this intellectual energy. Totally. Florence wasn't initially the biggest player, trade-wise or academically, but in the 15th century, wow, it just takes off, becomes this incredible hub for art and ideas, builds on earlier figures like Dante, Giotto.
And this ferment produces that figure we all know, the Renaissance man.
Yeah, the ideal of someone skilled in lots of different things, not just the scholar, but maybe also a diplomat, an artist, a theologian. The sources point to many people who embodied this kind of versatility.
And this connects to how they saw history, right? This idea of a dark age.
It does. The sources show humanists genuinely believe that after Rome fell, Europe entered this long dark age, and they were the ones restoring true civilization.
Which leads to our standard timeline. Middle Ages, then modern age, starting around the 15th century.
Yep. And the narrative embedded in that from the sources is that the church had kind of suppressed classical learning during the Middle Ages.
But again, modern historians looking at the sources are a bit more cautious.
Much more. They question that whole Dark Ages label and the idea of such a clean break.
Okay, now here's something crucial you mentioned from the sources that often gets missed. The Arab contribution.
Absolutely vital. While some classical texts survived in monasteries, it was largely Arab scholars who preserved, translated, and studied the bulk of ancient Greek and Roman knowledge, Plato, Aristotle.
Without them, it might have been lost to Europe.
A huge amount, yes. And it wasn't just preserving the old stuff. Europeans also translated Arab and Persian works.
Contemporary works.
Yeah, cutting-edge stuff for the time in science, math, medicine, astronomy, chemistry. Thinkers like Ibn Sina Avicenna or Ibn Rushd Averroes, they hugely influenced European thought.
And the sources say their names sometimes got Europeanized.
Right, which maybe obscured their origins later on, like Avicenna Averroes. Doesn't immediately scream Arabic scholar.
So the big takeaway here, this wasn't just about rediscovering Greece and Rome.
Not at all. The sources stress that technologies and skills in Asia were often way ahead of Europe, and those growing global links through the Islamic world, the Mongol Empire connected Europe to India, Arabia, Iran, China.
Europeans were learning from these places.
Definitely. But the sources suggest this debt often got downplayed later when history became very Europe-focused.
And how did these humanist ideas actually spread day to day? Education.
Yeah, humanist subjects started getting taught in schools, mainly for boys, the sources note, across Italy and then into other parts of Europe, even if universities stuck mostly to law, medicine, theology.
And besides schools, art, architecture, books.
Hugely important ways humanist ideas and sort of the whole feel of the era got transmitted. The sources make that very clear.
Let's talk about art then. This drive for realism. Albrecht Dürer.
Right, the northern artist influenced by Italy. The sources quote him saying, "Art is found in nature, you have to extract it. Use geometry, copy from life. The closer to life, the better the art."
That realism seems tied to a kind of confidence.
Yeah, you see it in 16th century Italy. Still deeply religious, but also this amazing confidence in human ability to achieve perfection in art, sure, but also to understand the world.
And they looked back to ancient art for models.
Definitely. The sources describe the excitement when fragments of Roman sculpture were dug up. It directly inspired sculptors like Donatello. His statues from 1416 were revolutionary in their lifelikeness, consciously trying to recapture that ancient ideal of the perfectly proportioned human form.
And this links art to science. Anatomy.
A really close link. Artists were actually going to medical schools, studying anatomy, bone structures. You have figures like Andreas Vesalius in Padua, first to properly dissect the human body. That's the start of modern physiology. And it gave artists incredible knowledge.
And painters were using science too, geometry for perspective.
Yep, creating that illusion of depth, studying light for 3D effects, using oil paints for richer colors. And interestingly, the sources show influences from further afield, Chinese and Persian art showing up in the costumes and paintings. Those global connections again.
So it's this mixed anatomy, geometry, physics, beauty that leads to realism.
That's the term used. Yeah, a style that dominates for centuries. And Leonardo da Vinci is like the ultimate example, right? The sources call him a disciple of experiment, interested in everything: botany, anatomy, maths, art. Mona Lisa, Last Supper, iconic.
And architecture saw a similar revival, especially in Rome.
Absolutely spectacular revival in 15th century Rome. The popes were getting politically stronger, and they poured money into rebuilding and studying the city's past.
Leading to archaeology, excavating ruins.
Yeah, people developing those skills. And the discoveries directly inspired this new architectural style, which was really a revival of the old imperial Roman style, what we now call classical.
Driven by wealthy patrons, popes, merchants.
Exactly. They hired architects who knew the classical stuff and artists to decorate the new buildings. Massive construction boom.
And again, you see individuals mastering multiple arts. Michelangelo.
The prime example. Sculptor the Pieta.
Right.
Painter Sistine Chapel ceiling. Architect St. Peter's dome design. Amazing. Or Brunelleschi, architect of the Florence Duomo, started as a sculptor.
And a key change the sources highlight. Artists start being known by name.
Right. Not just a member of the Stonemasons Guild. It's Michelangelo. It's Donatello. That focus on the individual again.
Okay, art and architecture you had to travel to see. But ideas in text, printing, changed everything there.
The sources basically call it the biggest revolution of the 16th century. Written word travels like never before.
And again, acknowledging the sources. Not purely a European invention.
No, the sources are clear. Europeans learned printing tech from China, partly through contact with the Mongol Empire. Same for firearms, the compass, the abacus.
Gutenberg's press, the impact was just mind-blowing.
Think about it. Before, maybe a few handwritten copies of a text existed. Then Gutenberg prints 150 Bibles in 1455. The sources say that's what one monk might copy in a lifetime.
Wow. So by 1500, classical texts are being printed all over Italy.
Loads of them, yeah, mostly in Latin first. And people could buy them. You didn't just have to rely on lecture notes anymore.
Ideas spread faster, wider.
Much faster. A single book could reach hundreds, thousands of readers relatively quickly. And it fostered a personal reading habit. You could own your own copy.
And this is why humanism spread beyond Italy so effectively.
The sources argue it's the main reason, yeah. Printed books could cross the Alps easily. Earlier intellectual movements often stayed local because handwritten stuff just didn't travel the same way.
Let's circle back to that idea of the human being. Humanist culture meant less direct control by religion day to day.
A gradual slackening, yeah. The sources show Italians were definitely interested in wealth, power, glory. But they weren't necessarily irreligious. It's more nuanced.
But some did challenge older ideas. Barbaro defending wealth, Vella questioning the ban on pleasure.
Exactly. They used classical learning to re-examine contemporary values. Valla even suggested history showed humans naturally striving for perfection and, well, enjoyment.
And there was a focus on manners. Being cultured.
Very much so, according to the sources. Polite speech, dressing right, having certain skills became important markers.
And the core humanist idea. Individuals can shape their own lives, not just through power or money.
Right, through developing their talents, their minds, this idea of a many-sided human nature. Very different from the fixed roles, priest, noble, peasant of feudalism.
But then you have Machiavelli. A rather different take on human nature.
Huh. Yeah, much more bracing view in The Prince. The sources cite him listing all the qualities princes get known for: generous or greedy, cruel or kind.
And his conclusion.
Pretty stark. All men are bad, basically. Driven by endless desires, self-interest above all, a real counterweight to that optimistic humanist view.
Now, a really important point the sources make, this new ideal of the individual, didn't really include women initially, did it?
Largely not, no. In aristocratic families, the sources describe men dominating everything public. Sons got educated for careers, daughters often ended up in convents if there wasn't a good dowry.
And women had no say in how their dowries were used. Marriages were business deals.
Often, yes. Women were generally expected to just run the household.
But it was different for merchant families sometimes.
A bit. Sources suggest merchant wives often helped in the business or ran it if the husband was away. Widows could sometimes have a more public role than aristocratic women.
But there were some women who embraced humanist learning, like Cassandra Fedele.
Absolutely. Remarkable figures. Fedele is quoted saying women should study even though it promises and offers no reward for women and no dignity. She became famous for her learning, gave speeches.
And she criticized the limits placed on women.
She and other Venetian women writers, yes. They pointed out the Republic's idea of freedom seemed mostly for men. And look at Isabella d'Este in Mantua. Ruled when her husband was away, made her court a major intellectual center.
And their writings show they wanted, economic power, education.
Exactly. Power, property, education. Things they saw as key to having an identity in a man's world.
But then contrast that with someone like Castiglione in the court here, his ideal woman.
Very different. The sources quote him emphasizing soft and delicate tenderness, feminine sweetness. She shouldn't resemble a man. Should stick to sports suitable for women.
Wow. Comparing those views really shows the tension, doesn't it?
It really does. Different ideas about women's potential floating around.
Okay, these humanist ideas travel north.
Oh.
To universities outside Italy.
Yeah, and they attract church figures there too, people studying classical texts alongside the Bible.
But the sources say Northern humanism had a different flavor, more focused on church criticism.
That's a key difference highlighted. They pushed for a return to what they saw as the original Christianity based on the oldest texts. They wanted to strip away rituals they thought were just later additions.
Offering a view of humans as free agents in their faith.
Right, directly engaging with Scripture. And figures like Thomas More in England, Erasmus in Holland, they used their scholarship to critique the church.
Especially things like greed or selling indulgences.
Exactly. Those documents people bought, thinking it reduced sin or time in purgatory. Humanists pointed out the problems with that.
And the printing press fuels this critique. Bibles in local languages.
Massively. Ordinary people could read the Bible themselves and see, hey, this stuff isn't in here.
And scholarship was used to undermine church power, too, like debunking the donation of Constantine.
Yeah, showing that key document justifying church power was a fake. That's a direct hit using humanist historical methods.
So the stage is set for Martin Luther.
1517. The German monk launches his campaign. His core message, according to the sources, you don't need priests as middlemen. Faith alone connects you to God, leads to salvation.
The Protestant Reformation begins. Churches breaking from the Pope.
Spreading through Germany, Switzerland, popularizers like Zwingli, Calvin, especially appealing in towns to merchants.
But there were more radical groups, too, Anabaptists.
Yeah, they linked salvation with social change. God made everyone equal, so no taxes, choose your own priests. Ideas that really appealed to peasants.
And translators like William Tyndale arguing passionately for the Bible in English.
Absolutely. The sources quote him saying the clergy kept scripture locked up in Latin for their own power and profit. Translation was essential for ordinary people.
But it got violent. Peasant rebellions.
Very violent. Luther himself condemned the peasant revolt, and it was crushed brutally. But the radical ideas survived, influencing later resistance movements like French Protestants arguing they could remove bad rulers.
So what was the outcome? A split Europe.
Pretty much. Some places stayed Catholic, some became Protestant. England went its own way with the monarch as head of the church. The Catholic Church allowed Protestant worship in some areas eventually.
And the Catholic Church reformed itself too, the Counter-Reformation.
Right. Internal reforms, emphasis on service, simplicity, and new orders like the Jesuits, founded by Ignatius Loyola, specifically to combat Protestantism, educate, and do missionary work.
Okay, so while all that is happening, there's another challenge to traditional Christian ideas coming from science.
A whole other angle, yeah. Copernicus is the turning point here, the sources say.
He challenged the Earth at the center view.
Exactly. The old idea was, Earth is sinful, doesn't move, everything revolves around us. Copernicus, though a devout man himself, mathematically argued that the Earth and other planets actually orbit the sun.
And he was nervous about publishing it.
Very. Feared the reaction. De Revolutionibus only came out right at the end of his life.
And others built on his work. Kepler, Galileo.
Yeah, they helped confirm it. Kepler showed orbits were ellipses, not perfect circles. Galileo used his telescope, saw mountains on the moon, moons orbiting Jupiter, proof the heavens weren't perfect and unchanging. His book, The Motion, was key.
All leading up to Newton.
Isaac Newton's theory of gravitation in the Principia Mathematica. That's seen as the culmination of this scientific revolution.
And the big shift here was how you gained knowledge. Observation, experiment.
Precisely. Galileo's famous line, "The Bible shows the way to go to heaven, not the way the heavens go. Knowledge from observation and testing, separate from belief."
Sparking advances in physics, chemistry, biology.
The whole scientific enterprise really takes off.
How did this impact ideas about God?
Varied responses. For some, nature and its laws seem to replace God as the explanation. For believers, God perhaps became more distant, the creator who set up the laws but didn't constantly intervene. And scientific societies started popping up, Paris Academy, Royal Society in London, spreading these ideas through lectures, experiments.
Okay, let's bring it all together. Back to that question. Renaissance. Sharp break. Dark Ages, really dark.
Well, the sources, especially citing historians like Peter Burke, really push back against that simple rebirth narrative of Burckhardt's. They stress continuity. Scholars did know classical stuff before. Religion stayed vital.
So calling the Middle Ages just gloomy is too simple.
Way too simple. Elements of the Renaissance trace back much earlier. There were other flowerings of culture before, like in 9th century France.
And remembering those global influences is key, not just Greece and Rome.
Absolutely crucial. Asian tech was often ahead. Learning came from India, Arabia, China via those Islamic and Mongol connections. A debt later Europe-centric history is often ignored, the sources point out.
But were there any really fundamental, lasting shifts that started here?
The sources suggest two big ones seem undeniable. First, this growing separation between public and private life.
Public meaning government, formal religion, private meaning family, personal belief.
Kind of, yeah. The individual starts having both a private self and a public role, not just peasant or lord. Artists being known by name fits this too. It lays groundwork for later ideas about individual rights.
And the second shift.
The rise of distinct national identities. Europe, once sort of unified by Rome, Latin, Christianity, starts breaking into states defined more by common language, shared culture.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. Cities reviving, humanism changing ideas, art exploding, printing transforming communication, new views of the individual, religious upheaval, scientific revolution.
It's clear it wasn't just a simple rebirth. It was messy, complex, interconnected. Building on the past, yes, but also shaped by global forces and definitely planting seeds for the future.
And understanding it helps us see where so many of our current ideas and debates come from, right?
Absolutely. Ideas about the individual, knowledge, questioning authority, they have deep roots back here.
So here's the thought to leave you, our listener, with. You live in a world flooded with information, global connections, constant challenges to what we thought we knew. How do you see the legacy of this era that focus on individual thought, on learning through observation, on reevaluating truth? How does that echo in your own life, your own experiences today?
Yeah, something to chew on.